a renter comes to you and they're being reasonable and they say, hey, I want to get out of my lease early. If you're willing to do that and saying, yeah, let's, you can do it. I'll agree to let you leave. You have to pay the July's rent. Then you should be getting your security deposit back.
Nothing will crush a real estate investor's spirit like landlord stress. The difference between being successful and miserable in managing properties is education. Welcome to Landlord University, where landlords learn. Landlord University is recorded from inside the RentPrep office, where Stephen White and Jeff Pearson share the lessons learned from working with some of the most successful landlords.
Welcome to Landlord University Night School. I'm Jeff Pearson. I'm here with my co-host, Stephen White. Hello, Stephen. How are you doing this evening?
Good, Jeff. We've got a great episode today because it's another episode that was inspired by a listener who reached out to us and had a very specific question. We went through, we answered his question, and decided, hey, this would be a good topic for a podcast. So we're going to be talking about security deposits and broken leases, and it kind of ties in with a previous episode that we've done just recently on when is it okay for a tenant to break a lease. So I think Matthew, who wrote to us, I believe Matthew's from Indiana, and he wanted to basically paint a very specific case scenario. So we'll go over that about basically how to deal with somebody who's breaking their lease and what the right way to deal with their security deposit is.
Sounds good.
But just wanted to point out, if you do have a question for us or a comment on the podcast, on the show, like Matthew here, reach out to us. You can email us at landlordu@rentprep.com. Again, it's landlordu@rentprep.com. And ask us your questions, fire away. I'll always make sure that we respond. We answer them, and who knows, it may turn into another episode.
Exactly.
So Matthew asks specifically in the case scenario that he painted here. He said he had, somebody's got basically a year's rent or a year's lease, and they want to leave 6 months early. They pay June's rent, and they move out on June 30th. He wants to know if he can keep their security deposit for the time that it's going to take to find a replacement tenant, or is the security deposit for damage to the unit only? Then he also wants to know how does this traditionally work or typically work for a professionally run apartment complex? So we're assuming that Matthew is an independent landlord, and he just wants to kind of get a good gauge for what everyone else in sort of the industry is doing. And I was glad to answer it and help him out with that. We certainly work with a lot of, apartment complexes and professionally, rental units that are doing this on a much larger scale. So I do have a good feeling as far as what they're doing. So happy to help Matthew out with that.
Absolutely. And, our goal here is to help Matthew and others like him have professionally run rental units.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're not getting paid other than the rent you're getting, but if you operate at that professional business level, it's going to make all the difference in the world. Everybody hears us talk about that all the time.
Right. So, the answer that basically we had given to Matthew was, in his scenario where the tenant pays for June, leaves on the last day of June. Again, just to specify, his state was Indiana. Just to make sure I was in line with the state laws, I went ahead. I went to nolo.com, which is a great resource for landlords, and looked up what Indiana state laws were regarding broken leases, security deposits, and based the answer, a lot on what they're doing, and then give him some personal experience that I've had too. So in his scenario, he wanted to know, can he keep the security deposit, use it towards rent? My answer to him was, as per state law, a landlord must make reasonable efforts to re-rent the unit and can't charge the remainder of the lease agreement. So obviously he understands, I'm sure, that he's not going to be getting 6 months worth of rent from this person.
Right.
In most cases, 95%, I would say, of the professionally run apartment complexes that we work with, they charge, if they're willing to let that person go and make an agreement with them, they charge a month's rent. That's their time to prepare, show the apartment, re-rent the unit. So a month's rent is usually, I would say, 95% of the time sort of the standard as far as what you would charge in a broken lease scenario. The important thing, I think, is to keep the security deposit completely separate as much as possible in this type of scenario. What you don't want to do is agree preemptively that their security deposit is going to count towards that July rent in this case, because if you end up going in there and there's damages, and the damages are going to exceed the amount that you have remaining on your security deposit, you just shot yourself in the foot and let them walk away without paying that July rent anyhow.
Exactly. We just recorded an episode of In the News talking about the state of Missouri wanting to lift the limit on security deposits. And, there's this whole thing about having enough money to cover the damages. It just doesn't make sense to put yourself in a situation where you might be exposed to having a lot of damage that you have to pay for when you've agreed to let that be your rent.
And, right before we jumped on the recording, Jeff, you had made a couple of really great points about how to really handle this situation the best way possible. And I agreed with everything you said, which is always going to be based on good communication. If you have a situation where, a renter comes to you and they're being reasonable and they say, hey, I want to get out of my lease early, regardless of what the reason is, if you're willing to do that and saying, yeah, let's, you can do it, go in there, check the place out, at least do a pretty basic inspection to make sure that there's not a ton of damage done to it, and explain to them that, you're not going to charge even maybe what your legal limit in the state that you're in could be more than a month's worth of rent. But just say, usually we need a month to prepare. If the unit's in good shape, let me come in there, check it out. I'll agree. You have to pay the July's rent, and if it's in the same condition as when I inspected it, then you should be getting your security deposit back, is how I would explain it.
Exactly. So ultimately, going in there and doing a cursory inspection, obviously you have to follow the laws, give them their proper notification, usually at least 24 hours. But when they come to you and say, I need to break my lease for whatever reason, you explain to them, okay, this puts a bit of a burden on me, but I want to do everything I can to make sure that this goes smoothly. And one of the things that I'm going to need to do is I need to begin to show this property so that I can have somebody rent it as soon as possible, so that I'm not looking at this loss of income. And so what I'd like to do is do an inspection and make sure that things are in reasonably good shape. With that inspection, if you agree in writing to return it to me in this same condition, then you can expect to get most or all of your security deposit back, and I will absolve you of your lease requirement. And so then you go and you do that inspection, you make sure that everything is the way it needs to be. If there are repairs, then you work with them on getting those repairs done, but you have an agreement in writing with them that they're going to let you show the unit, as well as that they're going to move out and leave it in that same basic condition. And just like our normal cash for keys, you could let them know, look, if I'm able to get this rented and only lose a small portion of rent, maybe I'll kick back an extra couple $100 in addition to returning your security deposit minus whatever repairs there are. I'll kick back a couple $100 just for us being able to work together to make this smooth, and for you allowing us to show this while you're leaving. Whatever you can do to make it work the best for you, and to be assured that when they leave, it's in good condition. That's what you're really shooting for.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that concept of having good communication, you don't want to run into a scenario where somebody feels like they're coming to you in a reasonable way saying, hey, I need to get out. You give them a hard time, and now they have incentive to take recourse on you and damage the property. So I think, if you run into a situation where the person wants to break the lease, you almost have to assume they're gone anyway. And at that point, it's minimizing your risk and trying to find the best way possible so that they're not going to do further or any damage, and everybody's sort of happy as they leave. Of course, you never want somebody to walk away early, but as we know, I mean, collecting past due rent is difficult, near impossible. And if they end up moving out or leaving in the middle of the night, you're going to be stuck.
That's right. And on their way out, they kick a hole in the wall and they break the key off in the lock. Those final little acts that will just cost you money and frustration, whereas working with them a little bit. And we've talked about it many times. So the bottom line with security deposits and broken leases, as you said, keep those security deposits separate, keep them for damages to the unit whenever possible. And certainly make sure, if you're going to consider using that for rent and things like that, pay attention to your state laws. Check out nolo.com to be sure that you know what the the laws are regarding security deposits. I know in California these days you have to have a separate bank account for that. So pay attention to those things because they can get very specific in different states.
Absolutely, and it's constantly changing. So
Yep.
be sure that you're reading the most. And Nolo's pretty good at keeping updates on there, and but make sure that you're reading the most up to date things. And just like you said, we were just covering a story, in Missouri, they're talking about lifting security deposit restrictions. So these things are constantly changing, and in your state it's a good chance that it's changed since the last time you looked even. So never a bad idea to check that stuff out, stay on top of it, and make sure that you're doing it to the letter of the law. You don't want to get into as we know, security deposit issues are the number one issue showing up in landlord tenant court. So knowing that ahead of time, you don't want to walk into a problem with a security deposit because it's from the renters perspective, they feel like that's their money, and so they're going to push back. They're not going to just let it go. A lot of times they're going to fight it. They're going to try and get that money back. So it's not something that everyone's just going to forget about. So do everything that you can to make sure that you're abiding by all the laws, and you're less likely to lose in court.
Well, perfect, Steve. I think that wraps up another episode of Night School, and I look forward to talking with you tomorrow evening.
Great. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for listening to Landlord University, and remember to visit rentprep.com/landlordu to see show notes and access free resources like forms and guides. And be sure to check out Jeff Pearson hosting his own hit podcast at thementorimpact.com.